is fighting. He is willing to discuss a surrender.
We haven't the proper facilities to take you all prisoner.
What?
We'd like to, but we can't accept your surrender.
Hello everyone, and welcome to another video on Our Own Devices. I'm Jean Messier, and I'm here in the magnificent museum basement of one of my collector friends, which you might recognize from my previous video on the folding BSA paratrooper bicycle. But today, I'm not looking at military vehicles, but rather some forgotten weapons. Sorry, Ian. Specifically, today we're going to be looking at British Empire/Commonwealth training rifles from the First and Second World Wars. Now, as I mentioned in my previous video on the .22 caliber training adapter for the C1A1 rifle, the Canadian version of the FN FAL, if you're an army trying to train tens or hundreds of thousands of new recruits in basic weapons handling and marksmanship, and you try to do this with your regular service rifle and full power military rounds, you're going to run into a number of problems. First of all, the recoil and noise of full power cartridges might prove overwhelming to certain recruits, especially those who haven't handled firearms before, and this can be detrimental to them learning proper marksmanship skills. There's also the problem of range design. If you're using full power ammunition, then you need to have a range with backstops that are thick and tall enough to absorb the rounds. And if your training center is located next to a civilian population center, you might get noise complaints from the neighbors. And finally, and often most importantly, there is the problem of cost. Full power centerfire ammunition tends to be expensive, and learning proper marksmanship requires putting sometimes thousands of rounds downrange. Multiply that by the number of recruits that you need to train, and the cost adds up very quickly. And this is why most militaries, for initial training, opt to use a much smaller, less powerful, less noisy cartridge, a Sub-Calibre round. Today that tends to be .22 long rifle, but other rounds have also been used. But once you have chosen your Sub-Calibre training round, as an army you then face another choice, which is what sort of training rifle are you going to use? Are you going to use a Sub-Calibre conversion, either temporary or permanent, of your regular service rifle? Are you going to use a commercial off-the-shelf competition rifle or a military adaptation thereof? Or are you going to develop your own training rifle from the ground up? And as we'll see in this video, over the past 140 years, the British Empire, British Commonwealth, has at one point or another tried out variations of pretty much all of these approaches. So the first Sub-Calibre training system used by the British Army was the so-called Morris tube, or aiming tube. This was patented in 1881 by Charles Morris, and this was very similar to the C1A1 adaptation kit that we looked at in a previous video. It consisted of a rifle tube that slipped into the barrel of the rifle and threaded into a chamber adapter at the rear end. And these were first issued in 1883 and used to convert the Martini-Henry rifle. And it converted the Martini-Henry down from its regular .577 450 round down to the .297/230 Morris round, one of these. And this was the standard Sub-Calibre training round at the time. It's a highly tapered, highly necked down center-fire cartridge. And when the British Army adopted the magazine-fed bolt-action Lee-Metford, they also produced Morris tube conversion kits starting in 1891. In 1904, however, the British Army officially adopted the .22 rimfire cartridge for training, and from this point forward, they tended to go for from the ground up designed training rifles or conversions of regular service rifles over temporary conversion kits like the Morris tube, though there were other approaches, for example, the .303 gallery cartridge. So this is an adaptation of the .303 smokeless powder round that was then in service, but with far less powder in the cartridge case and a very wide, flat-nosed wad cutter bullet. So this allowed you to use this over a shorter range, just as you would a .22 round, without risking over-penetration. Now, around the same time, the British really started looking into training rifles in a big way, and this was a direct result of the Second Boer War from 1899 to 1902. And there, in South Africa, the British found themselves seriously outgunned by the Dutch settlers, the Boers, who were crack shots and adept at making very long-range shots using the then state-of-the-art Mauser rifles. And so the British Army was very keen to improve marksmanship not only among its own ranks, but the civilian population as a whole, so they could be called upon if another war broke out. So in 1903, a civilian organization known as the Association of Miniature Rifle Clubs was formed for this very purpose, to establish small shooting clubs around the country to promote marksmanship among the civilian population. And in 1905, this association, along with the National Rifle Association, the British one, not the American one, and a special committee of the British War Office, got together to set out the requirements and choose a design for a standardized club rifle for these organizations. Design that they finally adopted was designed by Joseph J. Speed and Dr. H.T. Ashton at the Royal Small Arms Factory at Enfield, and this was designated the War Office 1906 pattern miniature rifle. Now, as the name suggests, these were adopted in 1906, and they were manufactured by BSA and the London Small Arms Company from 1906 until the outbreak of war in 1914. And they were used by the small rifle clubs along with a number of models of civilian training rifles, including the Cogswell and Harrison Certus rifle and W.W. Greener's miniature club rifle. Anyway, let's hop across the Atlantic to Canada to have a look at our first featured rifle of the video. Right, so this is the Ross model of 1912 Cadet rifle, and if that name sounds familiar, that's because, yes, this was made by the same Ross company that produced the .303 caliber Ross straight-pull bolt-action rifle for the Canadian Expeditionary Force at the start of the First World War. And that whole story has been covered in greater detail elsewhere, but here I'll give a brief summary. So just after the Second Boer War, Canada was looking to re-equip its military with the short magazine Lee-Enfield. However, the British wouldn't sell them any because they were all earmarked for rearming the British Army. They also wouldn't allow Canada to produce SMLEs under license, so Canada looked around for a native designed and built replacement. And they found it in the rifles of Sir Charles Ross, who was a very wealthy, rather eccentric, but brilliant gun designer who for several years up to that point had been producing a successful line of straight-pull bolt-action sporting rifles. And he offered to build a factory, a production line, at his own expense to provide the Canadian Army with rifles. And so he adapted his civilian designs, and after a couple of different versions to account for design flaws in the original rifles, the Ross rifle was officially adopted in 1910 as the M10 rifle, or Ross Mark III. And this is what the Canadian Expeditionary Force marched into war with in 1914-1915. Unfortunately, while the Ross rifle was a very accurate and excellent sporting rifle, it didn't stand up to the rigors of trench warfare. It tended to jam when it got full of mud. It didn't take the British service ammunition very well, which happened to be very loosely tolerant. It was a disaster, and very quickly, indeed by 1916, the Canadian Army had completely re-equipped with the short magazine Lee-Enfield. However, the Ross did stellar service as a sniper rifle, in which role it could be better taken care of, it could be kept free of mud and dirt, it could be fed with higher quality ammunition, and this is where its accuracy really shone. But anyways, that is a completely different story. What we're talking about here is the training variant of the Ross. So this was introduced by the Ross Company in November 1912, just as the M10 rifle was starting to enter service. And the Canadian government placed an order for 10,000 of these. And as far as anybody is able to tell, they built around 17,000 of these in total, with delivery to the Canadian militia starting in 1913 and continuing for another 3 years. And this was an adaptation of a civilian sporting 22 that Ross was already producing. And if I might take a slight detour here, I have a catalog of Ross products from this period, and the advertising copy for these rifles is charming and just absolutely hilarious. I'll give you an example here with this passage. It will put cats in the other world, or will slay tin cans and devastate reams of paper targets. And how can you say no to that? Now, the civilian version had a cut-down sporter-style stock and came in 18, 20, and 22-inch barrel versions, whereas the military pattern, the Cadet rifle, had a full-length military-style stock and a secondary sling swivel here for use with a shooting sling. Now, like most Cadet rifles of the period, this is a simple, single-shot, 22 caliber bolt-action rifle, which can chamber the 22 short, 22 long, and the 22 long rifle cartridges. However, the manual warns that if you're shooting a lot of 22 short, you probably shouldn't try to then chamber longer cartridges. This is because the propellant gases will wear away a ring in the chamber just ahead of the cartridge case, and this might impede the loading of longer cartridges. Now, this is a straight pull bolt action, just like the full bore Ross, but the mechanism is very different. So in the regular Ross, the lockup is via a set of male triple thread interrupted screw lugs. And when you push the bolt handle and the bolt carrier forward, the bolt is going to turn on a set of spiral cams, and it's going to rotate into some matching female threads in the receiver and lock up. And similarly, when you pull the bolt back, the bolt is going to rotate and unlock the threads. The Cadet rifle, however, uses a completely different system based on a locking wedge that engages on a tapered locking surface. It's also a cock-on-close mechanism, meaning that when I push the bolt forward, the rear of the striker is going to lock onto the sear, allowing you to stretch the striker's spring. And then the two locking surfaces engage, and the bolt locks in place. Now, interestingly enough, that locking surface is hinged and connected via lever to this little button in the front of the trigger guard. And if I push it when the rifle is loaded and cocked, the bolt pops open, allowing you to eject your round. Now, this seems like a very strange mechanism, but I can see this being of use on a rifle range where if the range safety officer tells everybody to clear their rifles, well, you just pop that button and your bolt pops open and you can easily show clear. And then if I actually fire the rifle, this has a snap cap in it, so I'm not damaging the firing pin, then the mechanism unlocks and you can just pop it open and eject your round. Now, interestingly, in his patent, Ross talks about the fact that if you adjust the angle of that locking piece ever so slightly, the rifle can be made semi-automatic, but that's semi-automatic in the artillery sense. So in several types of artillery pieces, when the breech recoils, it automatically opens, ejects the empty case, and remains open so that the crew just needs to throw in another shell, close the breech, and they can fire again. And that increases the rate of fire. So his idea was to use that wedge as sort of a delaying mechanism so that when you fired, the bolt would immediately spring open and eject the case, allowing you to immediately load in another round. But this does not seem to have actually been implemented in production rifles. Now, a couple of other features on the rifle. Like I said, secondary sling bar here for attaching a shooting sling. Our sights are a rear aperture on a threaded post, so that elevation can be adjusted by turning this knurled knob right under the receiver. Front sights came in a number of different varieties. There were ramped barleycorn sights, tube sights, and a swiveling hooded sight similar to the one on the 1906 pattern miniature rifle, with early hoods being brazed on and later hoods being spring-loaded and removable. So that's basically it on the outside of the rifle. I'll show you how to pull out and disassemble the bolt so we can see exactly how that works. All right, so first you have to turn the rear sight adjustment knob until it's in its full upright position. Then you press the release lever on the side and unscrew the rear cap. Then once that's done, if the bolt is locked forward, you press the release lever and then pull the trigger to pull out the bolt. And here, if you look at the bottom of the bolt, we can see the two locking surfaces, one for the bolt itself and one for the cocking piece and firing pin. Anyway, before we move on to the next rifle in our series, I just wanted to let you know that I will be taking out all the rifles featured in this video, except for one, out to the range to see how they actually handle. So that will be the subject of a separate video, so you can look forward to that. Anyway, moving on. Right, so hopping back across the Atlantic to the UK, In the early 1910s, the British Armed Forces realized that they needed more training rifles for their own troops. And so in August of 1912, the War Ministry approved the conversion of No. 1 Mark II and Mark II Star rifles into .22 caliber training variants. Now, if you've never heard of a No. 1 Mark II or Mark II Star, that's because these were older Lee-Metford and long Lee-Enfield rifles that were cut down into the short rifle pattern, so they handled identically to a short magazine Lee-Enfield. And since the armed forces had by this time been completely re-equipped with the short magazine Lee-Enfield, the No. 1 Mark III, all those older patterns were now declared obsolete and surplus, and so they were ideal candidates for conversion into training rifles. Now, later in 1916, when even more rifles were needed to keep up with training demands, the War Ministry approved the conversion of the Charger loading magazine Lee-Enfield and the short magazine Lee-Enfield into training variants. And these were designated the 22-inch RF pattern 1914 short rifle No. 2 and the 22-inch pattern 1914 long rifle. That nomenclature can get pretty confusing given that the pattern 1914 rifle is a completely separate design. Now, the early conversions for the No. 2 Mark I were made with purpose-built .22 caliber barrels, but later, as production of full caliber barrels for service rifles took precedence due to the war, this changed to a sleeving procedure wherein the barrel would be bored out and a sleeve with a .22 caliber bore would be slid in and soldered in place. And this was a process known as Parker rifling that was invented and carried out by the A.G. Parker Company Limited, which later in 1930 became Parker Hale. Like I said, early training rifles were manufactured from surplus full-bore rifles, but later on, especially in foreign armories like the Lithgow Arsenal in Australia, these rifles were built from the ground up as .22 trainers. So the vast majority of these .22 caliber conversions were simple single-shot rifles, though a number of attempts were made to produce magazines for them that would more fully emulate the full-power service rifle. And one such magazine that was actually adopted was the Hiscock and Parker 5-round training magazine. So this was invented by E.J. Hiscock in January 1912 and was approved in December 1917 for adoption as Magazine .22 Rifle Mark I, and around 5,000 of these were manufactured. But in practice, these proved to be unsuccessful, and they were very quickly withdrawn from service because they proved to be very finicky, very difficult to use, and not all that reliable. They weren't at all GI-proof, or in this case, Tommy-proof. So as we've seen, during the First World War, the British used all manner of converted surplus rifles, as well as cadet rifles and club rifles, in order to meet its training needs. And it wouldn't be until after the war in 1921 that they would finally settle on a standard pattern of training rifle, which is this, the Rifle No. 2 Mark IV. And this is a from-the-ground-up conversion of the short magazine Lee-Enfield to .22 rimfire. And so it has all the modifications you would expect. It has a .22 caliber barrel, has a different extractor, it has an offset firing pin to hit the rim of the rimfire cartridge. It also doesn't have a magazine. This is just a single-shot rifle. Now, in 1925, they would make two important modifications to this pattern. The first was the fitting of the Cooey 10A aperture sight. This was manufactured by the Cooey Company in Canada, and we'll talk about them in a second, originally for the Ross rifle. And since the Ross rifle was retired from Canadian military service in 1916, there were tons of these sights lying around, so they were fitted to the rifles. Originally, they were fitted with a sight that was meant to emulate the peep sights from a pattern 1914 rifle, and these were actually modified from the long-range volley sights of the Lee-Metford, which were horribly obsolete by this time, and there were tons in surplus, and that was known as the Sight Auxiliary Aperture Mark I. So another modification made in 1925 was to the magazine. So the original magazine for the No. 2 Mark IV was blanked off, so it provided a tray for loading in your rounds one at a time. But in 1925, that was removed so that the magazine became a brass catcher, and this helps keep your firing range a little bit neater. Now, something else to cover before we move on is this device here. Now, this isn't actually part of the rifle. this just clips on. This is called an aim corrector. This is just a little 45-degree mirror that clips onto the rifle. You can adjust the height of the mirror, and you can also pull the mirror out and switch it from left hand to right hand. And the idea is that when this is properly adjusted, if you look from the side, it is going to show your sight picture. And so your shooting instructor would stand beside you, look through the mirror, and would be able to give running commentary on whether your sights were properly aligned. Though, in my opinion, having your instructor basically right beside you, breathing down your neck, would do more to throw off your aim than to correct it. But that's just my opinion. Now, one potential downside of using .22 caliber trainers is that the loading procedure doesn't closely resemble that of the full-powered rifle. And so numerous attempts have been made to bridge this gap and make the experience of shooting a sub-caliber rifle as close to the real thing as possible, except for noise and recoil. And one of the more interesting attempts at this was the pattern of 1918 training rifle, also known as the 303 cum-22. So instead of loading in the .22 caliber cartridges individually, instead you had things called conveyors, and these were basically steel replicas of the proper 303 caliber cartridge that were bored out with a smoothbore barrel and a chamber in which you could insert a .22 caliber cartridge. And then these conveyors could be loaded into the rifle just like the real thing. And so it would give you the experience of loading and firing the rifle, again, without the recoil and the noise. And other modifications are also made to the rifle, including a .22 caliber barrel, a secondary extractor in order to eject those much heavier conveyors, as well as an offset firing pin. Now, while this sounds ingenious and like it would be very useful, it turned out to not be that reliable in practical use. And there were a number of reasons for this. Number one, the conveyors had a blunt squared off end, meaning that they tended to catch on the edges of the chamber, so the rifle was very finicky to use. Number two, there wasn't a great gas seal. The obturation was poor because you're basically pushing a steel plug into a steel chamber rather than having thin brass that can expand and seal against the chamber walls. So the rifle tended to kick a lot of propellant gas back in the shooter's face. And finally, there was the problem of keeping these conveyors loaded for the trainees. And it would be some poor schmuck's job to use a special loading tool to extract the spent cases and insert new rounds into these conveyors and supply them to the training class. And this proved to be more trouble than it was worth. It was a lot easier, logistically speaking, just to have the trainees use individual .22 caliber cartridges and later move on to using full power cartridges. So hopping once more back across the Atlantic, we get to one of Canada's standard training rifles of the Second World War. This is a Cooey Model 82. Now, if you're not from Canada, you're probably unfamiliar with the Cooey company, but they were about the only big, iconic, household Canadian firearms brand. And just like today, everybody's got a Ruger 1022 and a Remington 870 shotgun in their gun collection, there was a time when every Canadian household had a Cooey .22 caliber bolt-action rifle or a break-action shotgun. Now, Forgotten Weapons has already done an extensive overview of the Cooey company and some of its civilian offerings over the years, but to summarize, the company was started in 1903 by one Herbert Cooey, who was a machinist by trade, and during the First World War, his machine shop in Toronto was contracted to build rifle parts for a number of companies, including sights for the Ross Rifle Company, like the sight we just looked at on the No. 2 Mark IV, as well as some training rifles. And after the war ended, he realized how lucrative the firearms business could be, and so he switched gears and in 1919 introduced his first iconic firearm, which is known as the Model 39 or the Cooey Canuck, the Ace, the Etonia. Was sold under a number of different names. And this was a very bare bones, very simple, robust, .22 caliber bolt-action single-shot rifle. And its main selling feature was safety. So when you actually operated the bolt, you didn't actually cock the action. You needed to pull back on the cocking piece afterwards. And this made it a very safe rifle to operate, especially as an introductory rifle, a boy's rifle, if you will. So this rifle proved extremely popular. They sold a ton of them. The rifle won a Certificate of Honor at the British Empire exhibition at Wembley in 1924. And in that same year, Cooey supplied the rifles to the Canadian men's shooting team at the 1924 Paris Olympics. Now, in 1939, Cooey introduced another iconic firearm, which was the Model 60. And this was a repeating bolt-action .22 rifle fed from a tube magazine. And then after the Second World War, under the auspices of Herbert Cooey's son, Hubert Cooey, no confusion there, the company introduced the Model 84 single-shot break-action shotgun. And this was offered in a number of different gauges, from 410 all the way up to 12 gauge, and again, was wildly popular. But the company didn't last very much beyond this, because in 1957, Hubert Cooey unexpectedly died, and in 1961, the company was sold to the Olin Corporation, which owned Winchester, and a couple of Cooey designs were produced by Winchester and other companies throughout the rest of the 1960s. So the Model 82 here is a military pattern of a standard Pattern 39 style Cooey single-shot bolt-action rifle. You can see it has the exact same bolt system as the Model 39. If I cycle the bolt here, nothing happens because the action hasn't been cocked. You actually have to grab this cocking piece here and pull it back, and then the rifle will fire. As was standard, we have a full-length military or cadet style stock. We have a spring steel, very simple tangent leaf sight back here with a notch, and we have an adjustable peep sight at the rear. And other than that, there's really not much else to this rifle. So like I said, this was used during the Second World War, and this continued to be used by cadets and other civilian organizations throughout the 1960s and 70s. And there are advertisements from the 1960s telling cadets that, hey, you use these at the range when you go to cadets, you can actually buy one for yourself because there's tons of surplus ones left on the market. Anyways, moving on. So many of you will recognize this absolutely massive weapon here that doesn't even fit fully in the frame as a Boyce anti-tank rifle. This was the standard squad-level anti-tank weapon for the British Army when the Second World War broke out in 1939. Now, this was developed by one Captain Henry C. Boyce, who was the Assistant Superintendent of Design at the Royal Small Arms Factory, Enfield. And his name was spelled B-O-Y-S, and that is the name of the rifle. It's not B-O-Y'(S), possessive, as many publications say, although I'm sure many boys and many adults as well would love to have one of these. So despite being so big, this is actually a very simple weapon. It's a bolt-action rifle with a Ross-style locking mechanism, even though it isn't straight pull, fed from a 5-round top-mounted box magazine. And this fires the 55 caliber Boyce round, which was adapted from the American 50 BMG round, but given a belted cartridge case and a special tungsten cord armor-piercing round. Now, despite that, this was obsolete almost as soon as it entered service, because by that time, tank armor had gotten so thick that these were all but useless. They could be used to take out light armored cars and soft-skinned vehicles, and you could score certain victories against tanks by, say, taking out vision ports or periscopes or knocking off a track if you were lucky. However, these had to be replaced in 1943 by the Piat spigot mortar, which fired a more effective shaped charge warhead. Though these stuck around, they were used in the light anti-armor role and the anti-materiel role until the end of the war, typically mounted to jeeps, trucks, or universal carriers. Now, 3 different versions of this were produced during the war. There was the Mark I, which had the circular muzzle brake and a T-shaped monopod. There was the Mark I Star, produced by Inglis in Canada, which had a rectangular muzzle brake and a V-shaped bipod. And then there was an airborne version that had a cut-down 30-inch barrel and no muzzle brake. Now, of course, while this was in service, there was a need to train troops on how to use it, and especially train them in the fine art of deflection shooting, how to lead your target. And that's because this was intended for use against tanks, which would likely be in motion. However, they wanted to do this without having to subject trainees over and over again to the absolutely punishing recoil from the 55 caliber round. And so various schemes were devised to allow this to shoot .22 rimfire instead. And the first such scheme was a real kludge. It was a Rube Goldberg or Heath Robinson-esque device of clamps that allowed you to fix a rifle number 2 Mark IV to the side of the boy's rifle. And you would adjust the sights on the boys to account for the different barrel access, and you would have a bar connecting the trigger of the two firearms that when you pull the trigger on the boys, it would pull the trigger on the rifle. But they quickly figured out that this was very awkward to use in practice, so they came up with a more elegant solution, which was this. This is called a conveyor, and this is very similar to the 303 cum-22 conveyor for the rifle pattern 1918, only this is a 55 cum-22. So this is a steel replica of the 55 caliber cartridge with a squared off tip and a barrel and chamber to accommodate a single 22 rimfire cartridge. And once you inserted that, there would be a striker piece that would go in behind with a little nub to set off the rim of the cartridge, and you would load this into the rifle as per usual, and it would allow you to cycle the weapon and fire it as you would with full power rounds. But the firing pin of the boys would hit this little striker piece here and set off the 22 round, which would fire down the barrel. Now, this was a little bit different from the pattern 1918 system in that there was no conversion of the boy's barrel. This actually has a short rifled barrel in it, and so this is basically just a tiny pistol that you load into the rifle. And that bullet would go down the middle of the barrel and exit. And it wouldn't be very accurate given the short length of the barrel, but this was good enough for training on a fairly short 22 caliber target range. Two companies made these, Parker Hale in the UK and Cooey in Canada, and over the course of the war they made around 77,000 of these conveyors. So finally we arrive in the post-war period, and by this point most of the British Empire forces, with the exception of Australia and India, had switched over to the rifle number 4, and so it made sense to design the next generation of training rifles based on this pattern. However, in contrast to the typical urge of armed forces to share as much equipment as possible, the three branches of the British Armed Forces, the Navy, the Air Force, and the Army, decided in 1948 that they would adopt 3 different patterns of training rifles. So the Royal Air Force, for example, adopted the rifle number 7, which was a 22 caliber conversion of the number 4 rifle, but it was magazine fed. The regular rifle magazine was modified to accommodate a 5-round 22 caliber magazine from the BSA Sportsman. There was also a C No.7 manufactured by the Long Branch Armory in Canada, and that's what we have here, but this was single shot only. It didn't have the same magazine as the British number 7. But what's neat here is that the magazine follower has been modified to act as a feed ramp for single 22 cartridges, while at the rear we have a hole allowing the spent brass to fall into the empty magazine. The Royal Navy, meanwhile, adopted the rifle number 9, which was a single-shot conversion of the rifle number 4, very similar to the Canadian pattern. However, the Army decided to go in a completely different direction with their rifle number 8. So instead of trying to create a training rifle that looked and handled exactly like a full-service rifle, they decided to build it in more of a competition or match configuration. So the number 8 had a cut-down sporter-style stock and a heavier barrel, as well as match-style sights. It was also single-shot with no magazine. And early versions were built off of the surplus receivers from number 5 rifles, aka the jungle carbine, whereas later ones were built from scratch. And by 1950, the number 8 had superseded the number 7 and the number 9. All branches of the armed forces ended up using them. And they were used not only by the armed forces, but by cadets and other civilian organizations. I remember shooting one when I was in Air Cadets, and this continued to be a standard training rifle all the way to 2018, when it was replaced by the Savage Arms FVT, which was designated the L144A1 Cadet Small Bore Target Rifle. If you want to learn more about the number 7 and the number 8 rifles, please go over to Forgotten Weapons. Ian has a great video on both. Now, what's really neat about this number 7, or C No.7, the Canadian version, is that it actually comes with its original crate, which is very rare to find. And the crate even has the original cleaning rods designed specifically for this rifle. And apparently my collector friend who owns this took years to try and track this down. So you have your regular cleaning rod for a patch, then you have your different cleaning jags here. You have your nylon brush, You have your cleaning jag here, and a brass brush. So that is a brief history from 1883 to 1948 of British Empire training rifles. A huge shout out to my friend who wishes to remain anonymous for allowing me to film in his amazing basement and have a look at some of the rarities that he has in his collection. And as I said, I will be taking all of these rifles out except for the Boyce to the range to see how they fire. Unfortunately, this is Canada. The Boyce rifle is a prohibited device here. I can't take it out of this house. I know, I'm as disappointed as you are. But until then, I'm Jean Messier from Our Own Devices. Have a great day.